to the other link that you will be able to listen to the language that you prefer. Professor Suzana, now you have the floor. Be very welcome. Thank you, Kelita. Hello to all of you. I'm happy that we are all together. I'm going to shift to English.
You don't hear me? No? You hear me?
I hear. No.
Okay. Well, it's a pleasure to have you, to talk to you from your home in Jerusalem, beautiful Jerusalem. I'll say a few words as a formal introduction. Yossi Klein Halevi is a senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, where together with Imam Abdullah Antepli of Duke University, he co-directs the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which teaches emerging young Muslim American leaders about Judaism, Jewish identity, and Israel. Halevi is an author, a thinker, and commentator on Jewish and Israeli affairs. He writes for leading op-ed pages in Israel and the US, including Times of Israel, The Times, and Wall Street Journal. About his books, they are all nonfiction. Yossi's first book is Memoirs of a Jewish Extremist, The Story of a Transformation. It is a deeply personal book that tells how a child of Holocaust survivors perceived the reality through the lenses of his family's brutal past, and how he, Yossi, became a disciple of the late radical Rabbi Meir Kahane, and how and why he went through a deep spiritual transformation. His second book is entitled The Story of Israeli Paratroopers Who Reunited Jerusalem and Divided a Nation, a very self-explanatory title. And this book won the Jewish Book Council's Everett Book of the Year award. His third book bears the title At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden, a Jew's Search for God with Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. It tells us about another remarkable and deeply personal journey of 2 years in order to discover a common language with his Christians and Muslim neighbors, praying in their monasteries and mosques in Israel, in the West Bank and Gaza. His last book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, was published in 2018, and in its first week of publication, the book made it to the New York Times bestseller list of nonfiction, for nonfiction. This book was translated to Portuguese by Margarida Goldstein and published by Editora Contexto in 2022. This is the version, the Portuguese version of the book. Well, this book was inspired by a special number of the Israeli magazine Eretz Acheret, who published letters written by Israelis to Palestinians. In this book, Yossi speaks at the very complex strands of faith, pride, and anger as a Jew living in Israel. And he speaks not only to his Palestinian neighbor, but to everybody that cares about human dignity. The book is a powerful attempt to reach beyond the wall that separates Israeli and Palestinians. Surely I left lots of things unsaid in this brief introduction, but it is very striking and very interesting to learn from you about your intellectual as well as spiritual journeys, to learn how did you manage to reconcile inside of you your own fears, your own prejudice. What did you learn that you can teach us? So I have one first question for you, which is a really package kind of deal question, 3 in 1. The question is, we wanted to learn from your journey into Islam, your interaction with Islamic sages. We wanted to learn from your institutional work in the Muslim Leadership Initiative, and of course, to learn about what inspired you to write your last book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbors. We want to learn from your intellectual and spiritual journeys.
Well, Suzana, it's very good to be with you. Ruben, very good to be with you. And all of you in Brazil, delighted to be together. Thank you for inviting me. I have to preface whatever I'll try to figure out to say in response by noting the obvious, which is this moment and the complexity, the unbearable nature of this moment. And in all honesty, if I was listening to you talk about my journey into Islam and praying with Muslims in the West Bank, going into mosques in the West Bank and Gaza, which today is inconceivable. And then the book that I wrote to my Palestinian neighbor, and realizing that I would not have the emotional strength to go on that journey today or to write that book today. That's the truth. I am very glad I went on that journey. I'm very glad that I wrote that book. I believe still in everything that I wrote in that book. I'm very glad the book exists. But if I had to write it today, after October 7th, after this last year, I don't think that I would be able to, even if I would want to. And so this conversation, I just feel the need for some intellectual honesty, because for me to talk about my journey as if this were still happening right now is dishonest. And we need to look at this moment. And I hope that the time will come in the not too distant future when I'll be able to not only intellectually own what I've written, but also emotionally. And that I would have been able to write that book even in the future. So I'm at a little bit of a disconnect in where I am in myself, like most Israelis, like every Israeli. I'm angry, I'm disoriented, I feel disconnected in time. Most of the time, I don't know what day it is, what date it is. Since October 7th, I almost never know the date. Sometimes I forget what month it is. We've entered a kind of a timeless state here. And the same rage and disillusionment that we feel on our side, Palestinians obviously feel on their side. And I'm not going to go into a competition with them, but that's the reality. And so I appreciate the chance to speak about these issues with you, especially now when I'm feeling so detached from that journey, but it's very difficult. And it will be a very different kind of conversation than it would have been a year ago.
I understand.
Yeah, please.
What is your source of inspiration today? Where you look up for hope?
You know, one of my heroes in the Muslim-Jewish dialogue was a man named Rabbi Menachem Froman. And Menachem Froman, who died about 10 years ago, was someone I was very close to. He's one of the heroes of my book, At the Entrance to the Garden of Eden. He and I went on this journey together into mosques and Muslim communities, Palestinian communities. And Menachem Froman was a very interesting man. He was one of the founders of the West Bank settlement movement and the rabbi of the West Bank settlement of Tekoa. And yet he was also Israel's leading interfaith activist with the Muslim world and with Palestinians. At his funeral in his settlement, there were Palestinians there. He was somebody who was able to cross barriers, borders. And I'm mentioning him, first of all, because he gives me hope. His memory gives me hope. And also because I met his wife just recently, a few weeks ago. And I asked her about the work that she's continued since her husband's death. She has continued the work of dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. And I asked her, is there any hope after October 7th? And she said, no. She said, there's no hope. But there is faith. And I like that answer very much. And everyone can take that in their own direction. Faith is not necessarily religious. For me, it is religious. I'm a person of religious faith. But in the Jewish experience, there's also such a thing as secular faith. And we know that. There's faith in the Jewish people. There's faith in Jewish history. And so wherever one draws one's sense of hope, I feel a very strong need at this point to rely on faith. And what that really means is that if you look at the situation today rationally, and you freeze the frame, the image to this moment, there's no hope. Right now, at this moment, there's no hope. Israelis and Palestinians have never been more divided. There's almost no dialogue, no interaction happening. And people are on either side are looking at each other and seeing their worst nightmares about the other fulfilled. And what makes this such a painful conflict is that we're not just enemies, but each side embodies the other side's worst historical experiences. And so for the Arab world generally, not only the Palestinians, but the Arab world, and I would say much of the Muslim world, Israel is the colonialist West. We are the embodiment of all of their historical trauma with colonialism. For Israelis, the Palestinians are the latest enemy that's tried to destroy us. You know, in the Passover Haggadah, the prayer book that we use at the night of Passover, the Seder, there's a terrible phrase, which is in every generation there arise those to destroy us. And for Israelis today, the Palestinian national movement is this generation's genocidal threat to the Jewish people. And so each side looks at the other and we see the realization of our historical nightmares. And it's very hard to negotiate peace when the person sitting across from you is your worst nightmare, your worst enemy, an enemy who represents all the other enemies. And that's what makes this conflict, in part, so painful. And it's never been more true than today. Israelis and Palestinians look at each other. We look at Palestinians. What do Israelis see? We see rapists and crowds celebrating the massacre of October 7th. Palestinians look at us, and what do they see? Child killers and people who burn babies. So each side has become demonic for the other. So if you're asking me, is there hope right now? There's no hope, but there's faith. And the faith that I have is that anything can happen. Anything bad that we know, but also positive surprises. And you can never freeze the frame in our reality here in Israel and say, this is how it is, and this is how it's going to be. Because this is the most fluid and dynamic country, I think, in the world. And the changes that happen here, sometimes on a daily basis, and the last few days on an hourly basis. Historic changes happen constantly. So, you have to fasten your seatbelt and be prepared for the long journey.
So, perhaps also two questions in one. What do you think, which is what made such a change? Which is what changed the situation so much? Because terrorism was part of our life all along the history. And secondly, it will be very funny, but the academic one of us ask you about hope, and the religious one of us deveria falar em português, parece, me está dizendo aqui uma placa. Então vou perguntar em português. Yossi,
so he's going to ask in Portuguese. Can you hear the translation in English?
Okay.
Good. So let me ask in Portuguese. So I was saying that it's interesting to see that the academic one asked about hope, and which led you to speak about faith, and myself, the religious one, is speaking about the practical and theoretical aspects at the same time. So the question is, what had changed? What made this huge change so that you today cannot go in this journey, cannot write this letter to your Palestine neighbor? And what could happen, or what should happen, or could happen from now on in this situation?
Look, I can't speak for the Palestinian trauma. Palestinians are more than able to speak for themselves. So I'll speak for the Israeli side, and I'll speak for what happened to me. The trauma of October 7th is qualitatively different from anything we've experienced in this conflict. And maybe the only thing I can compare it to is the massacre in the city of Hebron, in 1929, when a Palestinian mob literally tore apart and massacred in the most horrific way 69 Jews who belonged to the ancient Jewish community of Hebron and were completely unarmed. This was before the creation of the state. What happened on October 7th was a kind of contemporary version on a much bigger scale of that massacre. And the shock of October 7th was multiple. The first was the cruelty, the atrocities that were committed. This wasn't just mass murder, but there was the intimacy of the attack, the cruelty, and the stories that are still coming out. You know, there's no end to the stories that of what happened on October 7th. So that was the first shock. The second shock was that we were so completely unprepared. Not only was the border open, which is a scandal in itself, but the army disappeared. For hours, Israeli citizens were left on their own against this murderous assault. So the shock, the deeper shock of October 7th is this is what happens when we don't protect ourselves. So what's happened in the Israeli psyche, for me and I think for almost all Israeli Jews, is the realization that we live in a region where anything is possible and where we are really hated. And our first commitment must be to defend us. And so before I talk about peace, before I talk about reconciliation, I have to defend myself. And when I think of a Palestinian state on the West Bank, and I'm not talking about someplace out there, I'm sitting in my apartment in Jerusalem, and I'm looking out at the lights on the next hill from where I'm sitting. The next hill is already the beginning of the West Bank. I live on the border of Jerusalem. And that's the West Bank, 1,000 meters from my home. And so if there's going to be a Palestinian state, and in principle, I'm still in favor of a two-state solution, I need to know who's going to be governing on the next hill. I need to know, will it be a peaceful regime or will it be Hamas? And I need to know that because I'm living on the border of a potential October 7th. If there's a Palestinian state there, all that will separate me from Palestine will be a fence, maybe a wall. Walls can be broken through, fences can be breached in no time. So these are the issues. So what changed for me on October 7th was the return of acute Jewish protectiveness.
Okay.
This has changed the political dynamics. The Israeli left has fallen apart in this country. There's almost nothing left of a left. And I never identified with the left. I'm a person of the center, but the pragmatic center, the center that does want a two-state solution. And I still do. But my overriding commitment post-October 7th is to make sure that that never happens again.
That what?
That it never happens again. Before I can talk about peace and coexistence, I have to make sure that October 7th never happens again. And that's not only on the border with Hamas, it's also on the border with Lebanon, which is very relevant right now.
É verdade que todos os
Is it true that all the Palestinians that live in the Gaza Strip are pro-Hamas? That we have no one anymore to speak with?
I don't think that's true. The latest polls, look, it's very difficult under the best circumstances to poll Gazans because they live under a dictatorship. And now, especially in these conditions, you can't really trust the stability of the polls. Nevertheless, there is a poll that was just taken that shows that a majority of Gazans now oppose October 7th, believe that October 7th obviously was a disaster for them. And so I think that the situation among Palestinians is very fluid. And it's interesting that, the perception abroad is that Palestinians get radicalized when they're losing, when the occupation and the oppression. But I think that Palestinians get radicalized when they seem to be winning. And post-October 7th, when it looked like the Palestinians had really delivered this major blow to Israel, and we were reeling, we were so disoriented. Most Palestinians, according to polls, were very enthusiastic about October 7th. And so now there really is the beginning of a re-examination. And I would hope that Palestinians would ask themselves a very hard question. And we have hard questions that Israelis need to ask ourselves too, which I'll be happy to discuss if you're interested. But the question that I expect Palestinians to ask themselves after this terrible Gaza war is, why is the pattern of Palestinian history always repeating itself? The Palestinian national movement attacks Israel. They lose terribly. They have tragedy inflicted on themselves. And then they say it's not fair that they lost. The Gaza war is not fair. The Nakba wasn't fair. But the pattern is the attack on Israel and then Israel's counterattack. Now, that's on the Palestinian side. Palestinians, I think, need to ask themselves, why is their national leadership always leading them into one disaster after another? Why has the Palestinian leadership rejected every offer that was ever on the table for peace, every offer for two-state solution that Israel has offered? So that's on the Palestinian side. On the Israeli side, we have hard questions to ask ourselves too. The first question is, how did we get to the point where we have a government like this? In the past, we had governments that were really peace governments. This is not a peace government. This government is not interested in peace. If this government were offered the choice of genuine peace, let's assume that there emerged a Palestinian leadership that really was for peace. That's not the situation today. But let's assume it was. This government, this Israeli government, would reject peace. It would prefer occupation and annexation and settlements to peace. And so I have to ask myself as an Israeli a hard question as well. All these years, I always said, that whenever it came down to it, if there was a real offer on the Palestinian side for peace, of course we'd say yes. And of course we would be ready to trade land for peace. Now we have a government that would not say yes. And how did we get to this point? How did we get to this point where the worst elements in Israeli society, the most racist, the most extreme, are in major positions of power in this government? So the burden is not only on the Palestinians by any means. This tragedy, this conflict has two parents, and we both have to own our share of the responsibility for it.
Yossi, the tragedy of first of all, I have to say,
Suzana, acho que nós temos que falar em português.
Em português?
Sim, chega ele em inglês, porque assim as pessoas escutam de uma forma, me parece, é isso que é a mensagem que eu recebi.
Yes, so please speak in Portuguese. So let me reflect, because I taught in English. Yes, I also have changed.
I wrote a book in Portuguese, so
Eu escrevi.
feel free to speak in Portuguese.
Okay, so you are Baquibe Portuguese.
Para português.
Deixa eu pensar, Ruben, né? Eu estava pensando em
So
inglês.
let me reflect a little bit. Fine. So
I'm gonna speak in English because I thought in English. It will be in English. First of all, we share the pain and disorientation. It is very easy for us to ask questions, of course, but all the Jewish world is suffering, is in deep suffering, and but I noticed that the tragedy of October 7 brought like a new impulse inside of Israel regarding the ethnic minorities of Israel, the Druze, the Israeli Arabs, the Bedouin minorities, that a sense of shared destiny that it wasn't there before as strong as it is now. And we also heard about heroes that came out of their homes to save Jews in October 7th. Do you perceive that as a hope for a more cohesive Israeli society, a new strength, a different Israeli society is in the process of being born now? Now we are suffering at Sirim, the pains of childbearing, but do you perceive this as a possibility, a reality?
I would say a cautious maybe. And with the Bedouin, for example, who are almost 200,000 people in Israeli society, there's definitely been a positive turn since October 7th. Over the last years, there were growing numbers of Bedouin who were becoming radicalized, moving in a direction of radical Islamism. But since October 7th, we're seeing a real reconnection of the Bedouin community with their Israeli identity. And the reason for that is that 20 Bedouin were killed on October 7th. And several Bedouin were taken prisoner, were kidnapped by Hamas. The Israeli army just rescued, the other week, we rescued a Bedouin hostage. And that had an important impact on how many Arabs see their place in Israeli society. The fact that the Israeli army was willing to sacrifice soldiers' lives to save a Bedouin hostage because he's Israeli, that we took his Israeli identity seriously. And so I think that all of these factors are very positive. On the other side, the Gaza war has been deeply traumatic for Arab Israelis. And many of them watch Al Jazeera, and they get their news straight from Al Jazeera. And so we in Israel see a very different war than they experience. And so I think it's premature to say that the outcome of this war will be positive, will strengthen the place of Arabs in Israeli society. And the other aspect that worries me is that there is growing anti-Arab hatred among young Israeli Jews. And that, of course, could have an impact on the ability of Arabs to find their place in Israeli society.
do the Palestinians, you spoke before about our current government, but as much as you know, do the Palestinians want peace? Are willing to negotiate anything? Because perhaps, as much as I listen from my friends from the center and left, or former center and left, they say the answer to your question proposed for them to ask themselves is very clear.
It's very clear to me.
They want everything. They don't want us there.
Listen, there is a difference.
Do you agree with that?
I do agree with that. I don't think all Palestinians want Israel destroyed, but in the Palestinian leadership, in the Palestinian national movement, the only difference that I see between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is a question of short-term pragmatism. Long-term goals of the whole Palestinian national movement are the same, which is from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. If they believe that at Columbia University, they certainly believe that in Ramallah. And so the difference, there is still a difference between the Palestinian Authority and Gaza. And the difference is that the Palestinian Authority is willing to cooperate with Israel, even militarily, on certain limited aims. But the long-term goal of the Palestinian Authority, of Mahmoud Abbas, is no different than the long-term goal of Yahya Sinwar, and that is the disappearance of a Jewish majority state. Absolutely. So at this point, when I look at our two governments, there's a real symmetry because neither people has a government that's capable of making genuine peace. Now, that was not true in the past. That's what I was trying to say earlier. In the past, we did have Israeli governments, many Israeli governments, that really were interested in a two-state solution. There was the Rabin government, of course, and then the government of Ehud Barak in 1999, and then Ehud Olmert in the early 2000s. We had a series of governments that were committed to peace as a strategic goal for Israel. The Palestinians have never had a peace leadership. They've had a leadership that pretended to be for peace. Yasser Arafat spoke about peace all the time, but only in English. When he spoke in Arabic, he spoke about jihad. Jihad, jihad, jihad. He would always say it 3 times. And that's the case. It's the case for the Palestinian leadership generally. Yasser Arafat was the model. You speak peace in the foreign language and you speak jihad in Arabic.
Mas então isso é justamente o que
So
alega
this is exactly what the right wing is gaining more and more space in Israel. All of the left-wing government were not able to achieve nothing because on the other side there's no left wing. So if there is no left wing, and since everyone wants to kill us, so we have to defend ourselves.
Yes.
E se esse é também seu...
If this is also your reasoning, Yossi, so in this way, I want to ask you, what shall we do with the Jewish ethos in the face of so many terrorist threats and in the face of so many innocent killing as well?
So what I've just described to you is the right-wing half of my political being. I also have a left-wing half. And the left-wing half says Israel cannot be a permanent occupier of another people. The Jewish people didn't come home to rule another people. We came home to free ourselves, not to take away the freedom of another people. And so that's my equally powerful truth. And the left and the right, for me, and for many Israelis, are not arguing only out there. They're arguing in here, inside of me. And I have a left-wing side and a right-wing side. And the right-wing side does not trust the Palestinian leadership at all. And the left-wing side says, where is this heading? What kind of an Israel are we going to have 20 years from now if this continues? And so I mentioned earlier that I'm a centrist, and I'm a centrist because I am the meeting point of left and right. I believe that the right has an essential truth, and the left has an essential truth. And I have to face reality, because both of those camps are saying something that is true about Israel's situation. And so I have to somehow navigate between those two truths. Now, my conclusion from October 7th is that the Israelis and the Palestinians will never make peace on their own. Left to ourselves, we will never make peace. The international community cannot force us to make peace. The only hope that I do see for peace is the region, the Middle East. Now, along with all the terrible things that are happening, something really extraordinary is happening too. And that is that we have peace with a half dozen Sunni Arab countries. And this is the first war where all those countries have kept their ambassadors in Israel. They didn't recall their ambassadors as they did in previous wars with Hezbollah, with Hamas. They're all staying in place. Saudi Arabia is still sending signals that it wants peace with Israel. So when I look at peace with the Palestinians, I'm not looking at that narrow point of Israel and the Palestinians, because there's no hope. There's no hope. We are at the lowest point in 100 years of bitter conflict. This is the lowest point. But there's a region, and the conflict was never just between Israelis and Palestinians. This was always a regional conflict. And the international community always misses this. They don't understand that they're always focusing on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It was never that. It was always the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Sunni-Israeli conflict. But now that Israel is gradually making peace with the Sunni world, we're shifting to a new regional conflict, which is the Shiite-Israeli conflict. And that's where we are today. The hope that I have is that the Sunni world will become real allies for Israel. And we're seeing the beginnings of that happening. The peace that we have, the Abraham Accords, are not just these formal ceasefires that are officially called peace agreements, like with Egypt and Jordan, but are not real peace. The peace that we have with Morocco, with the UAE, with Bahrain, is a real peace. And the peace that the Saudis want with us is also a real peace. And I know this from very close sources. The Saudis are actively seeking and nurturing a real peace with Israel, even now. And so this is what gives me hope. and that in the context of a regional solution, we'll be able to think about ways in which Israel can gradually, and I emphasize gradually, begin to detach from the occupation. It's going to be a very slow process. We're going to have to test every small stage. And if the Palestinian leadership is not capable of delivering, there will not be a Palestinian state. There are many peoples in this world that want statehood and don't have it. The Palestinians may never get a state. I believe that it is in Israel's interest to do everything we can to try to reach a two-state agreement, short of national suicide. I'm not going to commit suicide to give the Palestinians a state. That I'm not ready to do.
What would you change in your letter to the Palestinians if you wrote it now, after October 7th?
Well, I don't know. I think what would change is that I don't know if I'd be able to write a letter right now. I don't know. But I think that when I wrote the book, I was very careful not to tell the Palestinian readers what I think of your national movement. This is what I think of your leaders. This is my anger. I did at the beginning of the book speak about how we got to this point where people like me who believe in a two-state solution don't trust the Palestinian leadership. I felt that was important to explain. But then I just stopped writing about my critique of the Palestinian leadership and wrote about my own story, the Jewish story. And so the book, I think the book has resonated for many Palestinians because I didn't lecture them. I was just telling them my story. If I were to write a letter today, I would be much tougher about my critique of why they have failed for 100 years to reach statehood and why they're going to continue to fail unless they start changing their policies.
Yossi, I still want to talk about your book because it is in Portuguese and it's going around and people are reading the book, especially the new generations, and it is a permanent book. So this kavod is yours. You did it, and it is here, and it is inspiring.
I have to own the book.
Sorry,
I wrote it, and I'm glad I wrote it, and I'm glad that young people are reading it.
Yes. And there is lack of good books going around with such. And I read the book. I learned a lot. I learned how to tell my own story. I think this was very magic. It was very clever because, as you say, you don't lecture and you show. I read also the letters of Palestinians, which is an addendo to the book in the end of the book. I'm no psychologist. I'm just a biblical scholar, but I read it. I try to grasp beyond the words, okay? And what I grasped from their letters and from your narrative is that the tone of the narrative was so important. The tone of the narrative, not the narrative itself. Sometimes you are kind of harsh in your ideas, but your tone opened doors because it was humble, it was sincere, it came from a place of vulnerability, which is just human, and they could, in my view, shatter the solidify the image of the oppressor and identify with empathy to our plight, the plight of the Jews, etc. And I think that I learned from this tone that you used, that could really raise empathy and bring people to answer to you.
We appreciate that, Suzana, because the book, it's a short book, but it took me 6 years to write. And the actual text was written very quickly, almost effortlessly. It was the tone that I had to keep working on. And I went through multiple drafts. I showed the book to Palestinian friends. I got critiques. This is wrong. This is no, don't do that. And it was 6 years of work on my voice. And for me, there are really, for me, empathy is the key to peace. The ability to ask yourself a very simple question, which actually begins with curiosity, even before empathy. Empathy is a moral condition. Curiosity is more of a personality quirk. I'm curious. There's no moral component to curiosity, but curiosity is the precondition for empathy. And curiosity, asks a very simple question. I'm sitting here in my room, looking out at the next hill. I wonder who those people are. I wonder what they're looking at me. I wonder if any of them are thinking, who lives in that house? What kind of people are they? So it doesn't begin from this place of, I want to make peace with you. I care about you. It doesn't begin with Buber's I thou. It begins more with, what's going on over there? And, I worked for many years as a journalist, and a journalist's basic tool is curiosity. Now, the spiritual evolution of curiosity is empathy.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know who you are because I need to know, not just because I'm curious. I need to experience. I need to know what you're experiencing. I need to know what I'm doing to you, what my presence on this hill is doing to your presence, your life on the next hill. That's already not curiosity. That's empathy.
But this is Buber and Levinas also. Sorry, but this is.
But what I'm saying is that it doesn't begin with Buber.
No. You accomplish, you achieve it.
It ends with Buber.
Mm-hmm.
For all I know, Buber began with curiosity too before he got into I thou, And so, so that was my own process, actually. My process, that I moved to Israel and I came here. I was working as a journalist, and a journalist has to be curious. And so I was curious about the Palestinians. I started interviewing people. And then my heart started opening. I started hearing stories. And then the religious side of me became engaged. It wasn't only the moral side, it was also the spiritual side. Here we are in this sacred land, the land that I believe is sacred. And maybe my neighbor believes it too. And can we figure out a way of being religious people together in this land? And that was the journey. That was my second book, the journey that I went on in the Garden of Eden, the journey into prayer, a journey of prayer, of learning to pray in a Muslim prayer line with a kippah. going into mosques and joining Muslim prayer line and doing the same in monasteries. And for me, this was this was spiritual empathy. And so I believe very much in the capacity of empathy to heal.
Yeah.
Great. Okay, I think that this is a fondly, lovely, and very hopeful message that helps us to end this, unfortunately, end this meeting, close it. And agradecer a todas as pessoas que estão aqui conosco hoje.
I want to thank all the people that are with us here today in the Zoom, those that are with us in the YouTube transmission, both in English or Portuguese, all of us that are with us in YouTube, the members of the big community at the University of São Paulo of Jewish Studies that came from the great initiative of this center that worked very strongly and diligently, and not always with the acknowledgement that they deserve in such academic community. So congratulations for existing in the need and of events such as this one that you promote. And also with us, we have the community of the Jewish Academia from CIPI that participates in many courses and cultural events of all kinds and in different times and with a lot of curiosity. And the largest community that not necessarily are part of the University of São Paulo, nor of the CIP, the Brazilian Society, are members of the CIP as a whole. And we want to thank also the Hazit Pogrim, which are the greatest hosts and shachanim of all these initiatives. So we hope to continue to promote meetings and studies such as this one. Thank you very much to all of you.
Continuemos juntos, estudando, aprendendo y...
So let's continue together.
I will now have to go and write down what I just said to remind myself that I actually said that. So thank you all.
These are the best thing you said in all this hour of our talk. This is wonderful. This is wonderful. And to see the smile in your face is wonderful.
So thank you. Thank you all.
Okay.
I look forward to engaging with you again. Take care of you.
Thank you.